Sunlight poured through the windows of the small, cozy home as Mr. and Mrs. Johnson finished packing their last boxes. Their son, Daniel, looked on with wide eyes, filled with both excitement and nervousness. The Johnsons, proud members of the Black community, were about to embark on a new journey to the town of Greenwood. They had heard rumors of better opportunities, modern facilities, and a more promising future for children. It was not an easy decision to leave behind the neighborhood where generations of their family had grown up, but they believed in stepping forward for the sake of Daniel's education and dreams. Even though the Johnsons were leaving a place they had known all their lives, they felt a deep sense of resolve. They remembered the stories passed down from their grandparents, stories of determination, unity, and hope. The elders had always taught them that despite centuries of discrimination and countless challenges, Black families grew stronger by sticking together and fighting for what was right. Mrs. Johnson, in particular, carried her grandmother's fierce spirit. Her grandmother had marched in protests, demanding equal rights for her children and grandchildren. Those efforts shaped Mrs. Johnson into a woman who would do anything to protect and uplift her family. The morning they left was filled with a mixture of sadness and excitement. Close friends and neighbors from their old community gathered to say goodbye. These were the people who had watched Daniel grow from a shy toddler into a bright and curious boy. Hugs, tears, and words of encouragement flowed freely as everyone promised to stay in touch. And the Johnsons knew they were carrying not just their own hopes, but also the hopes of many who wished to see a young Black child thrive in a new environment. In a way, Daniel represented a collective dream, a dream that with proper education and support, children from the Black community could rise to any height they desired. The drive to Greenwood took several hours, but the family spent most of it talking about the future. Daniel sat in the back seat, staring out the window at endless fields and tall trees. He imagined the new school he would attend, picturing shiny classrooms and friendly teachers. Mrs. Johnson spoke softly to him about the importance of staying true to his roots. "Never forget where you come from," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Hold your head high and know that you carry the spirit of our ancestors in your heart." Arriving in Greenwood was both thrilling and intimidating. The town was bigger than their old neighborhood, with rows of neatly kept houses and a bustling main street. People walked briskly from store to store, and children played in immaculate parks. As Mr. Johnson drove past the large school building, Daniel caught a glimpse of the wide football field and the tall, gleaming windows of the classrooms. His heartbeat quickened. He thought of the Black pioneers he had read about, figures who had broken barriers in education despite facing massive discrimination. In that moment, he promised himself he would work hard just like they did. Yet, beneath all the excitement, the Johnsons felt a familiar uncertainty. They had encountered prejudice before and knew that not everyone in Greenwood would be welcoming. Stories of other Black families being ignored or overlooked in certain neighborhoods echoed in their minds. However, the Johnsons believed it was better to face challenges head-on rather than run from them. Mr. Johnson reminded his wife and son that their strength came from unity. "We stand together," he said, gripping the steering wheel. "No matter what happens, we support each other and keep going." They soon arrived at their modest new house on a quiet street. The paint on the exterior was a little faded, and the lawn needed some care, but it was a place of their own. Daniel hopped out of the car and ran around the front yard, imagining how they could plant flowers or maybe even grow a small vegetable garden. Mrs. Johnson placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder and smiled through her tears. Moving was never easy, especially when leaving behind a beloved community, but she knew this was the first step toward a brighter tomorrow for Daniel. Over the next few days, the Johnsons busied themselves unpacking boxes, hanging curtains, and making the house feel like home. Though the neighborhood was mostly unfamiliar faces, some neighbors did drop by with welcoming words. Others stared from across the street, uncertain whether to extend a hand. The tension was subtle, but Mr. and Mrs. Johnson felt its weight. Nonetheless, they kept their spirits high. Each night, they gathered around the kitchen table and discussed the upcoming task of enrolling Daniel at Greenwood High, a school reputed for its academic excellence but also rumored to be slow in embracing diversity. Despite any lingering doubt, Daniel's excitement was infectious. He carefully laid out his notebooks and pencils in his new room, mentally preparing for the day he would walk through Greenwood High's doors. He imagined making new friends and discovering new books in the school library. More importantly, he felt a strong sense of responsibility to prove himself, not just for his own sake, but for the entire Black community that had placed their faith in him. He remembered the words of civil rights leaders he had studied. You have to keep fighting for what you know is right, no matter how hard it seems. By the time the Johnsons were ready to meet the principal, they had steeled themselves with hope, determination, and love for one another. That morning, dressed in their Sunday best, they held hands as they walked out the door, fully aware that this school visit was more than just a formality. It represented their family's journey, their community's struggles, and their collective dream for better opportunities. All their emotions, the sorrow of leaving home, the pride in their heritage, the yearning for acceptance, converged in a single, powerful resolve to give Daniel the education he deserved. And so, with courage in their hearts and their son's future in mind, the Johnsons stepped forward into Greenwood High, ready to face whatever awaited them. Early on a Monday morning, the Johnson family found themselves standing in front of Greenwood High's imposing brick facade. The sun's rays glinted off the tall windows, and rows of carefully trimmed hedges lined the entrance path. For Daniel, who clutched his school folder nervously, it felt like stepping into a world that was both exciting and intimidating. Behind him, his mother gently rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder, while his father led the way through the large double doors. It was a moment they had imagined countless times, walking into a place that could offer the quality education every child deserved. Yet, as soon as they entered the front office, a wave of unease seemed to settle over the space. The receptionist, who wore a forced smile, kept darting quick, uncertain glances at the family. Mr. Johnson politely introduced them, explaining they had an appointment with Principal Roberts regarding Daniel's admission. The receptionist's smile flickered before she rose and led them down a long, polished hallway. The echo of their footsteps rang out in the silence, amplifying the tension that grew with each step. When they arrived at Principal Roberts's office, the woman knocked softly on the door before opening it. Principal Roberts, a thin man with neatly combed gray hair, sat at a large mahogany desk, surrounded by tall bookshelves filled with trophies and thick binders. His office was immaculate. But there was something cold about it. No family photos, no personal touches, just an air of formality that kept people at a distance. He barely looked up from the file in front of him, instead nodding for the Johnsons to take a seat. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat. "Good morning, Principal Roberts," he began. "We recently moved to Greenwood, and we'd like to enroll our son, Daniel, in your school. He's a bright student with a strong interest in science and—" Principal Roberts abruptly held up a hand, halting Mr. Johnson mid-sentence. He shifted his gaze to Daniel, who shrank into his seat under the weight of the principal's cold stare. "I see," Principal Roberts said slowly. His voice was measured, each word carefully chosen. "You do realize that classes have already started for the term, yes?" Mrs. Johnson, determined to show her son that they would not be easily discouraged, nodded. "Yes, sir. We've prepared all the necessary documents. Daniel's last report card, his birth certificate. Everything is in order," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. She recalled the nights she'd stayed up, making sure they had gathered each piece of paperwork. It was crucial for Daniel to receive a fair chance, especially in a school touted for its academic excellence. Principal Roberts opened the folder and flipped through the documents. He seemed to examine each page for a moment longer than necessary, as though searching for a fault. An uneasy quiet fell over the room as the Johnsons waited. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "The issue," he began, tapping his pen against the desk, "is that we have very limited seating in our classrooms. Our enrollment is high this year, and we don't typically admit students after the school year has begun." Mr. Johnson's shoulders tensed. He had expected some questions, but an outright refusal felt like a punch to the gut. He remembered the countless warnings from friends about discrimination, about how even well-reputed schools could find subtle ways to exclude black children. Still, he had hoped Greenwood High would prove more open-minded. Daniel looked at his parents, his eyes brimming with both confusion and apprehension. He thought about the stories of black trailblazers who had broken barriers in education, often at great personal cost. Is it happening to us? Right here? Right now? He wondered. Sensing the turning tide, Mrs. Johnson interjected, her voice slightly trembling. "With all due respect, Principal Roberts, Daniel deserves the same opportunity to learn as any other student. We wouldn't be here if he didn't need a good education. We understand the year has started, but he's ready to catch up quickly. He's an excellent student." A thin line formed on Principal Roberts' lips. He carefully placed the folder on his desk, folding his hands on top of it. "I'm afraid we just don't have the space," he repeated, his voice void of emotion. "Of course, I wish we could help every student who wants to enroll, but unfortunately, Greenwood High has high demand and limited resources." The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut. Mr. Johnson gripped the arms of his chair, fighting the urge to voice his growing anger. He recalled his father's advice. Keep your head held high and your tone measured, even if the world tries to tear you down. Taking a deep breath, he tried once more. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for a seat in a classroom, nothing more." Principal Roberts stood, signaling the end of the meeting. He held out the folder, offering it back without so much as a glance at Daniel. "I'm truly sorry," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But our enrollment period is over. If a spot opens, we'll be in touch." Mrs. Johnson gathered the folder with trembling hands, her heart sinking. She knew that "if a spot opens" was likely an empty promise. Daniel's hopes of joining Greenwood High were being dashed before they had a real chance to bloom. She could feel her son's disappointment radiating in the tense air. Wordlessly, the family rose from their chairs. Daniel trailed behind his parents, casting one last look at the trophies on Principal Roberts' shelves, symbols of achievement and success that now felt so heartbreakingly out of reach. Outside the office, the same receptionist looked at them with thinly veiled pity. As they stepped into the hallway, the reality of the principal's denial weighed heavily on their shoulders. They walked in silence, each lost in thoughts of frustration and hurt. Mr. Johnson's mind spun with questions. Were they simply late, or was this because they were a black family in a predominantly white school? Was this legal, or just an ugly residue of bias? Mrs. Johnson struggled to keep her emotions at bay, to remain composed for Daniel's sake. When they finally exited the building, a gust of fresh air hit them, but it did little to ease the suffocating sense of defeat. In that moment, the Johnsons recalled the countless times black families throughout history had faced closed doors and oppressive systems. Yet, in remembering those struggles, they also remembered the resilience that pulsed through their community like a lifeline. From the segregated classrooms of the past to the daily battles still fought today, the black community had always rallied behind its children, refusing to let them be cast aside. Walking away from Greenwood High that day, Mr. Johnson found renewed resolve. He would not allow a principal's thinly veiled discrimination to define his son's future. It was clear they would have to fight, and maybe fight hard, to break through the barriers standing in Daniel's way. And fight they would. With each step they took away from the school's polished doors, the Johnsons held onto a single, unwavering truth. The spirit of their ancestors lived on in them. Their determination was fueled by generations of hope and struggle. One denial would not silence them. One closed door would not keep them out forever. They would keep pushing, keep hoping, and keep believing in the promise that Daniel's education was worth every battle they would have to fight. That afternoon, the Johnsons walked away from Greenwood High feeling defeated. The late summer sun shone down on the clean sidewalks and manicured lawns, but none of it lifted their spirits. Mr. Johnson held Daniel's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze, while Mrs. Johnson kept glancing at her son's downcast face. They had tried to shield him from life's unfairness, hoping that their move to Greenwood would grant him new opportunities. Yet, Principal Roberts's cold denial echoed in their minds. Their hearts felt heavy, and the weight of the black community's historical struggles pressed upon them like a silent reminder that the fight for equality was never truly over. Once home, they settled in the living room, where unopened boxes still lined the walls. The room seemed brighter earlier that day, promising a fresh start. Now it felt like a hollow space, reflecting their discouragement. Mrs. Johnson sank onto the couch, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Daniel hovered near her, unsure how to comfort his mother. He had never seen her look so vulnerable. "We can't let it end like this," Mr. Johnson finally said, his voice carrying a renewed sense of resolve. He stood by the window, staring out at the quiet suburban street. "We've come too far to turn around now. Our ancestors faced worse, and they kept going." Mrs. Johnson drew a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She remembered the stories she'd been told as a little girl. Stories of how her own grandparents had attended segregated schools with tattered books and broken desks. Despite those hardships, they had persisted. "We're not giving up," she murmured, looking over at Daniel. "This is our child's future." Though Daniel didn't say much, his eyes spoke volumes. The shame of rejection still stung, but beneath that hurt was a small but growing spark of determination. He recalled the lessons he'd learned from reading about civil rights leaders, people who had been shunned and humiliated yet fought back with dignity and an unbreakable spirit. That evening, while his parents prepared dinner in tired silence, Daniel disappeared into his room. He opened his beloved biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., reading the lines that had inspired him before. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Daniel whispered these words to himself, committing them to memory. If he could keep them in his heart, maybe he would find the courage he needed. A few days later, Mr. Johnson learned from a neighbor about a teacher at Greenwood High who was known for her inclusive attitude and for championing students of all backgrounds. Her name was Mrs. White, and she had been teaching there for nearly 2 decades. Many local families said she had a reputation for going above and beyond for her students, regardless of color, religion, or family income. Intrigued and hopeful, Mr. Johnson decided to seek her out. He managed to catch Mrs. White just as she was leaving the school one afternoon. Standing by the school gates, he gently called out her name. She turned around and Mr. Johnson introduced himself. Mrs. White, a petite woman with kind, bright eyes, listened intently as he explained the situation, how Principal Roberts had refused Daniel a spot, how the Johnsons feared their son would be left behind academically, and how they felt that subtle discrimination lurked beneath the surface of that rejection. As Mr. Johnson spoke, Mrs. White's expression shifted from sympathy to a quiet outrage. "I'm so sorry," she told him, her voice tinged with genuine concern. "That's not right. There's no reason Daniel should be turned away, especially if there's capacity in the classrooms. Let me see what I can do." That simple promise was enough to reignite the Johnsons' hope. The next day, Mr. Johnson received a phone call from Mrs. White, asking if he could come back to the school for a more in-depth meeting. Eagerly, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson got Daniel ready, and once again, they walked into Greenwood High. This time, though, they felt slightly less alone. Mrs. White greeted them in the lobby, flashing a reassuring smile before leading them into a small conference room. "Yes, so I've looked over your son's grades and past projects," she began, gesturing to the paperwork Mr. Johnson had shared previously. "Daniel is clearly a bright student. It would be a shame for this school to miss out on nurturing his potential." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the family. "I spoke to Principal Roberts and insisted we revisit Daniel's admission." Mrs. Johnson felt tears prickle at the corners of her eyes. The mere fact that Mrs. White had stood up for their son, without knowing them personally, moved her deeply. She recalled the community spirit she had grown up with, where neighbors helped neighbors, and how, even in times of hardship, there was always someone who would speak up for justice. Mrs. White, though not a member of the Black community herself, seemed to embody that same compassion and willingness to do what was right. "Principal Roberts is cautious," Mrs. White continued gently, choosing her words. "He's worried about classroom sizes, but I've verified that we do have space. I urged him to reconsider. He agreed to a second conversation with you, and I'll be there to help facilitate." A surge of relief and gratitude washed over Mr. Johnson. He reached across the table and gently gripped Mrs. White's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "We've felt so powerless these last few days. Thank you for seeing Daniel for who he is. Not just a number or a late enrollment." Mrs. White nodded. "I believe every child deserves a fair chance. That's why I became a teacher. I'll do everything in my power to make sure Daniel gets his seat here." She looked at Daniel, who was listening intently. "I'd love to have you in my class if things work out. We're reading a fascinating unit on scientists from diverse backgrounds. I think you'd really enjoy it." Daniel's face brightened for the first time in days. "I'd love that," he said softly, a small but genuine smile creeping across his features. They spent the next half hour discussing Daniel's academic history, his interests, and the learning goals Mrs. White had in mind for her students. She also warned them that changing Principal Roberts' mind might take patience. "Be prepared," she advised kindly, "because sometimes people change their decisions slowly, especially when their pride or their prejudices get in the way. But don't lose heart. Greenwood High is supposed to represent the best in education, and I won't stand by while a bright child is turned away." When the meeting concluded, the Johnsons followed Mrs. White back through the hallway that led to the main entrance. This time, the atmosphere felt subtly different. It was as though the school corridors were no longer quite so intimidating. There was someone here, someone in a position of authority, who believed in Daniel and was willing to fight for him. And that belief, that willingness to stand up for what was right, echoed a timeless message that resonated deeply with the Johnsons' experience as part of the Black community, standing together, supporting one another, and never letting closed doors define a child's future. Outside, a warm breeze tousled Daniel's hair, and he lifted his chin with renewed determination. Mrs. Johnson wrapped an arm around him, proud of how he was handling the uncertainty. "Thank you," she repeated to Mrs. White, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She felt as though they were on the cusp of something significant, a step closer to breaking down the barrier Principal Roberts had hastily put up. Mrs. White parted ways with the family, promising to schedule a meeting with the principal soon. As the Johnsons made their way home, they spoke in subdued but hopeful tones. Yes, there might still be challenges ahead, discussions with the principal, potential hostility, and the ever-present possibility that prejudice could rear its head again. But for now, they had found an ally. In that single act of kindness and solidarity, they saw a reflection of the unbreakable spirit of the Black community, a spirit that had weathered centuries of hardship yet continued to push forward, fueled by the firm belief that every child deserved a chance to shine. The day Daniel had waited for finally arrived. Despite the tension and uncertainty, Principal Roberts had conceded to Mrs. White's persistent advocacy, and Daniel was now officially enrolled at Greenwood High. The Johnson family felt a mixture of relief and anxiety when their suffer this Heartwarming. While Mrs. White's support had opened the door, they still sensed that not everyone at the school shared her welcoming attitude. Nevertheless, on a bright Monday morning, Daniel found himself standing at the threshold of a brand new classroom, clutching his backpack straps with trembling hands. Mrs. White greeted him warmly at the classroom door. "We're so glad to have you," she said, ushering him inside. Her gentle voice offered a moment of solace amidst the confusion. Rows of desks stretched across the room, sunlight filtering through tall windows. Excitement flared within Daniel. This was the place he'd dreamed of, the place he'd worked so hard to reach. He imagined diving into assignments, raising his hand to answer challenging questions, and discovering new ideas. But his hopes dimmed when the teacher's aide approached. She gave Mrs. White a curt nod and then pointed to a desk in the far back of the room, near a drafty window and well away from the front board. "He can sit there," she said briskly, barely glancing at Daniel. The moment felt like a punch to the gut. Daniel willed himself not to look shaken, reminding himself of the stories of resilience he had read about countless times, stories of black children persevering through far worse forms of segregation. He forced a small smile and thanked the aide softly, even though she had already turned away. Mrs. White's eyes flickered with concern, but she said nothing, perhaps sensing that too much protest might endanger Daniel's precarious new start. In the hallway after class, Daniel saw other children laughing, chatting, and rushing to their next lessons. A few stared at him curiously, some offering half smiles, others sizing him up as though he were from a different planet. The feeling of isolation gnawed at him. He missed his old neighborhood, where everyone knew his name, where church gatherings brought people together every Sunday, and where neighbors felt more like extended family. At Greenwood High, he felt invisible, or worse, singled out in ways that were not welcoming. That evening, Daniel's parents asked him how his first day had gone. He tried to sound optimistic. "It was okay," he said, careful not to meet his mother's gaze. He knew she would see the hurt there. He didn't want her to worry. Mr. Johnson, however, sensed something was off. He prided himself on reading his son's emotions. After dinner, he asked Daniel to help him take out the trash. Outside, beneath the fading orange sky, Mr. Johnson gently prodded, "So, how are things really going, son?" Daniel hesitated. He had always looked up to his father, a man who carried the legacy of their black community with quiet dignity. He decided to be honest. "I have to sit at the back of the classroom," he admitted, voice trembling slightly. "I can't see the board very well, and sometimes the teacher's aide doesn't even call on me when I raise my hand. The other kids, I'm not sure they want to be friends." A flash of anger and sadness crossed Mr. Johnson's face, but he quickly masked it, not wanting to show Daniel just how deeply it cut him. "Listen, Daniel," he said quietly, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "There will always be people who underestimate you because of the color of your skin. But you come from a long line of fighters. Your grandparents, your great-grandparents. They endured real struggles so that we could stand here today. That strength lives in you." Daniel nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and responsibility. He had read about segregation before, but experiencing even a semblance of it firsthand felt far more painful. Still, if his ancestors had fought for the chance to learn in schools that once barred them entirely, he could endure a back-row seat. He vowed to himself that he would prove his worth through his academic performance, showing everyone that he belonged. In the following days, Daniel immersed himself in his studies. He spent hours each evening reading textbooks, completing math problems, and reviewing notes, sometimes squinting because he couldn't quite see the board during class. Whenever the teacher's aide ignored his raised hand, he wrote down his questions to ask Mrs. White privately. She seemed genuinely worried about his seating arrangement, but hinted that she couldn't override the principal's office. Nevertheless, she offered encouraging words and took time after class to answer his inquiries. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson watched her son's transformation with both pride and sorrow. She saw the way Daniel buried himself in books, how he sometimes rubbed his eyes in frustration, and how he came home with slight droops in his shoulders after particularly tough days. She recalled the stories she'd heard from her mother and grandmother, how separate water fountains, back-of-the-bus mandates, and underfunded schools once defined everyday life for black families. It pained her to realize that echoes of those inequalities still lingered. Yet the black community's resilience also resonated through the Johnson household. Church members from their old neighborhood called to check on them, offering prayers and words of encouragement. Miss Patricia, the community activist, even mailed a care package of inspirational books. One of them, an anthology of black poets, especially touched Daniel. Reading those verses reminded him that his people had always found ways to rise above stifling circumstances, expressing hopes and fears through the power of words. As the weeks rolled by, Daniel's diligence began to pay off. His first major test scores came in, and they were impressive. Quiet whispers traveled through the hallways. The new kid in the back row had outscored some of the top students. A handful of classmates started coming to him for homework help, drawn by his evident knack for understanding the lessons. Their hesitancy gradually gave way to curiosity, and some even expressed surprise at his willingness to assist, expecting perhaps an aloof response to their earlier coldness. The teacher's aide, however, remained resistant to giving him more opportunity in class. She continued to seat him at the back, as though to remind him of his place. Daniel handled her dismissiveness by working harder. With every assignment returned to him marked with an A, a spark of confidence lit within him. He thought of how his hard work was more than personal ambition. It was a statement, a testament to the resilience inherited from ancestors who demanded equality in education, in opportunity, and in life itself. At home, the Johnsons clung tightly to their faith and shared history. Mr. Johnson maintained his calm resolve, reminding his family that battles for justice were often won through steadfast perseverance and unwavering dignity. Mrs. Johnson offered Daniel support each night, cooking his favorite meals and listening as he talked through his day, ever so proud of his growing maturity. Her eyes brimmed with tears once again, but this time they were tinged with hope. Daniel himself felt something shifting in his spirit. He thought about the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., about judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Even if his seat was in the back, nothing could stop him from standing out academically. He would show the entire school, Principal Roberts included, that no one's potential should ever be confined by discrimination. In that sense, the unkind classroom, however difficult, became Daniel's stage to shine, and through every struggle he faced, he carried not just his own dreams, but the dreams of the black community that had sacrificed and pushed forward for generations. Day by day, Daniel's life at Greenwood High turned into a delicate balancing act. Each morning, he woke up with a mixture of determination and dread. Determination to prove himself in an environment that kept him at arm's length, and dread of the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that he did not quite fit in. The weight of discrimination pressed on him, but he was determined not to crumble beneath it. He maintained his seat at the back of the classroom, isolated from the main group of students, yet he refused to let that isolation define him. Whenever the teacher's aide ignored his raised hand, Daniel jotted down detailed notes and found moments after class or during lunch breaks to seek Mrs. White's guidance. She remained his steadfast ally, one of the few educators who acknowledged his presence with genuine warmth. Outside of class, Daniel noticed more eyes turning toward him. Some students whispered when he passed by in the hallway, eyes flicking over him with curiosity. Others seemed to be re-evaluating their assumptions. After all, Daniel was quickly proving himself a standout in tests and assignments. Even from the back row, squinting at the chalkboard, he managed to grasp complex problems and ace pop quizzes. Word spread that the new kid was not only polite but exceptionally smart. Over time, a few classmates began to approach Daniel, albeit cautiously. It started with small requests. "Hey, can you help me with this math problem?" Or, "Do you understand the homework? I'm stuck." At first, Daniel felt uncertain how to respond. Part of him wanted to recoil, remembering how those same students had snickered or whispered about him just a few weeks earlier. But a stronger part of him, the part that recalled stories of great black leaders offering kindness in the face of injustice, won out. Instead of bitterness, he extended patience and assistance. He hoped to show them that being different did not mean he was less deserving of respect or friendship. This slow shift didn't happen without hurdles. Each time Daniel felt he was making progress with a classmate, another incident reminded him just how firmly discrimination clung to the halls of Greenwood High. One day, after an impressive science presentation, Daniel found racial slurs scrawled on the corner of his desk. His hands shook when he discovered it, anger and hurt burning in his chest. But instead of lashing out, he quietly erased it. He remembered his parents' words that every test, every project he aced was a blow against the walls, built by prejudice. It was a painful truth that he had to be stronger than the insults thrown at him. At home, Daniel's parents noticed both his perseverance and the toll it was taking on him. Mrs. Johnson frequently found him in the living room, immersed in his books. He stayed up late, his brow furrowed in concentration, determined not to give anyone an excuse to doubt his capabilities. Sometimes she wished he would take a break, maybe play a game or watch a movie like other kids his age, but she understood that Daniel felt he was fighting for more than his own success. He was fighting for every black child who'd ever been told they didn't belong. On weekends, Mr. Johnson made it a priority to share stories of proud African-American trailblazers. Together, father and son revisited biographies of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Thurgood Marshall. Individuals who faced unimaginable adversity and still triumphed. Daniel's eyes glowed whenever he read about these towering figures. If they could accomplish so much under conditions far worse, he told himself, then he could find the courage to excel in a single classroom where prejudice lurked, but did not completely bar him from an education. Back at school, Mrs. White decided to channel Daniel's talents into something more visible. She asked him to tutor a small group of classmates who were struggling with math. At first, they showed up reluctantly, shuffling their feet and avoiding Daniel's gaze. But after a few sessions, they realized he was patient and friendly, and that he knew the material inside out. One of these classmates, Sarah, timidly thanked him after a session, admitting she'd been wrong to assume he wasn't worth talking to. Daniel accepted her thanks, managing a small smile. Each time a fellow student warmed to him, he felt a spark of hope for himself, for that student, and for the gradual shift in the school's culture. Still, there were moments that tested his resolve. The teacher's aide, who insisted he remain in the back, continued to give Daniel the cold shoulder. It felt like every small victory Daniel achieved was met with a reminder of his supposed place. One day, after Daniel broke a record on a timed math challenge, the aide muttered under her breath, "Someone must have helped him." Daniel heard it, and the sting of those words echoed in his mind for days. Yet he pressed on, remembering the many times in history black excellence was dismissed as a fluke. "This is nothing new," he told himself. "I just have to keep going." In the midst of these daily battles, the Black community's support enveloped Daniel and his family like a protective quilt. Though they were far from their old neighborhood, word of Daniel's struggle and perseverance traveled among friends, relatives, and church members. Letters and phone calls began trickling in. People offered encouragement, shared Bible verses, and sent small tokens of pride, like handmade cards praising Daniel's courage. Miss Patricia, the community activist, even arranged for a local radio station to interview Daniel's parents about their experience with educational barriers. Though Mr. Johnson hesitated to speak publicly at first, he eventually agreed, believing it might help other families facing discrimination. As the school year continued, Daniel's grades climbed higher and higher. He often scored the highest in class, leading some students to abandon their prejudices and simply admire his skill. Teachers, beyond Mrs. White, couldn't ignore his glowing performance. Slowly, a new kind of murmuring filled the hallways. He's really smart. He works so hard. He's one of the best students. Yet, Principal Roberts remained distant, rarely engaging with Daniel or his parents. The teacher's aide still made it a point to seat Daniel away from others, as though to ensure he never felt fully welcome. Despite the frustration, Daniel sensed an undercurrent of possibility. Each test he aced felt like another stone in the foundation of respect he was building. Each classmate he helped felt like a step toward understanding. And each time he walked into Greenwood High, he did so with his head held a little higher, fueled by the strength of his ancestors' struggle for education and the unwavering support of his family. In those quiet moments of reflection, Daniel often thought of the phrase he loved most from Dr. King: "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that." As he continued to rise above discrimination, he realized that his success, the very act of keeping pace, surpassing doubts, and bringing light to a back row seat, was in itself a form of protest. His excellence contradicted every prejudice stacked against him, illuminating a path for others to see that perseverance could shatter even the most deeply ingrained barriers. And so, with each day, Daniel carved his name into the school's history, proving that talent, hard work, and dignity knew no color lines. Although discrimination still lingered in the corners, his relentless spirit and the enduring legacy of the Black community he represented were powerful forces. He was not just learning geometry and grammar, he was showing Greenwood High and the world at large what it looked like to face prejudice and emerge stronger. Through that strength, Daniel was quietly but unmistakably reshaping the narrative of what it meant to be a young Black student in a place where acceptance was never guaranteed. As the final school assembly drew near, Greenwood High buzzed with excitement. News spread that awards and honors would be handed out to celebrate the best performing students. In every corner of the school, hushed conversations turned into loud whispers about who might claim the top spots this year. All eyes seemed to drift, sooner or later, toward Daniel, the boy from the back row whose steady rise in the ranks had caught everyone's attention. Daniel could hardly believe how quickly the year had passed. He remembered walking into the school for the first time, Principal Roberts refusing him admission, and the teacher's aide directing him to the back of the room like an afterthought. Yet, despite every stumbling block, Daniel had pushed forward, each day gathering more knowledge, more confidence, and more inner resolve. He had studied into the late hours of the night, relying on the support and love of his parents, who reminded him that his success was not just for himself, but for their entire Black community, past, present, and future. In the days leading up to the assembly, the atmosphere in the Johnson household was tense but hopeful. Mr. Johnson could sense something shifting in the air. After dinner, he would join Daniel at the kitchen table, reviewing test material or going over practice questions in math and science. Mrs. Johnson busied herself flipping through the pages of old family photo albums. She liked to show Daniel pictures of his great-grandfather who had once cleaned offices by night so he could afford textbooks for his children. He believed in the power of education, she reminded Daniel, and You're carrying on that legacy. Daniel found deep comfort in these reminders of the struggles and triumphs of his ancestors. He often paused to think about the countless black children who had walked into segregated classrooms, faced scorn from peers, and persevered anyway. He felt like he was continuing that long line of determination. If they could do it under far harsher conditions, he could certainly hold his head high here at Greenwood High. Even if he was seated at the back, on the morning of the assembly, Daniel's heart pounded with both excitement and a flicker of doubt. He dressed in his neatest clothes, checked his reflection in the mirror, and tried to steady his nerves. His parents were by his side, offering words of encouragement. "You've done your best," Mr. Johnson said, patting his son on the shoulder. "That's all that matters." The large auditorium at Greenwood High was packed with students, teachers, and parents. Banners hung from the walls, and the stage was adorned with trophies and certificates. Mrs. White gave Daniel a kind smile from where she stood with the other teachers, reminding him that he had at least one ally in the room, someone who had believed in him when few did. Principal Roberts took to the microphone, shuffling a stack of papers. He began to list off various awards for art, sports, and community service. As the ceremony progressed, Daniel's nerves only grew stronger. He looked out over the sea of students, some of whom had once eyed him with suspicion but now nodded or waved, their old prejudices slowly thawing. In the crowd, Mrs. Johnson clasped her husband's hand. They both exhaled in unison, waiting for the academic awards to be announced. Finally, Principal Roberts cleared his throat. "And now," he said, glancing at the list in his hand, "we come to our highest academic honor, the top student in the entire grade." A hush fell over the auditorium. Daniel could almost hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. "This year's highest score belongs to—" Principal Roberts paused, a strange look crossing his face. "Daniel Johnson." For a moment, absolute silence reigned. Then applause erupted, scattering Daniel's lingering worries like leaves in the wind. The noise swelled, rising from the front rows to the very back of the auditorium. Daniel felt all eyes on him, but instead of shrinking, he lifted his chin. His heart soared with pride, gratitude, and amazement. He made his way through the crowd, each step feeling lighter than the last. When Daniel reached the stage, he caught sight of his parents in the audience. Mr. Johnson's eyes glistened with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. Mrs. Johnson pressed a hand to her heart, her face reflecting a mixture of relief and boundless pride. He also spotted Mrs. White beaming from the sidelines, her applause as enthusiastic as the rest. Principal Roberts handed Daniel a gleaming plaque and a certificate. In that moment, the principal looked visibly uncomfortable, almost contrite. Daniel's mind flashed back to how this man had refused him on his first visit, claiming there was no seat for him in the entire school. And yet, here they stood, acknowledging that Daniel had surpassed every expectation placed upon him. Clearing his throat, Principal Roberts leaned into the microphone. "Daniel," he began, the words coming slowly, "you've shown extraordinary dedication, intelligence, and perseverance. I want to take this moment to apologize for the way I treated you when you first arrived. You've proven that you deserve your place here, and I see now that we should never have questioned that in the first place." A hush fell once more. The auditorium's mood shifted from joyful celebration to a collective intake of breath, everyone eager to see how Daniel would respond. Emotion surged within him, relief, vindication, pride, and the long-sought recognition of his true worth. Yet Daniel also thought of the pain, the quiet tears, the late nights of study fueled partly by anger at being relegated to the back row. He found himself wishing his ancestors could stand here beside him, sharing in this moment of triumph and long overdue respect. He stepped forward, gripping the plaque with both hands. "Thank you," he said softly, turning his gaze to Principal Roberts. In that single phrase, he poured all his relief, gratitude, and a tempered acceptance of the principal's apology. He didn't need a lengthy speech. His whole journey, his results, and the applause ringing in his ears spoke louder than any lecture could. The applause resumed, renewed and thunderous, echoing through the auditorium. Daniel blinked back tears as he looked out over the standing crowd. In that instant, he knew his victory was bigger than a trophy. It stood for all the black children who had ever been told they couldn't sit at the front of the bus, or the front of the classroom, or anywhere they chose to be. It was a testament to the sacrifices made by generation after generation so that he could stand here and receive recognition for his hard work. After the ceremony, classmates, some who had never spoken to him before, came up to congratulate him, shaking his hand with genuine admiration. Mrs. White gave him a tight hug, her eyes sparkling. The teacher's aide, who had always insisted on keeping him in the back row, hovered awkwardly on the edge of the crowd before finally managing a stiff nod. It was the smallest of gestures, but Daniel noted it, understanding that even the hardest hearts sometimes soften when confronted with undeniable excellence. In the parking lot, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson gathered their son into their arms, each holding a corner of the plaque. Tears streamed down Mrs. Johnson's face, and even Mr. Johnson couldn't mask his overflowing pride. "You did it," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "No, we did it," Daniel corrected gently, remembering all the late-night pep talks, the stories of their ancestors, and the shared burden of proving their worth in a school that had not wanted to let him in. Walking away from Greenwood High that day, Daniel felt a sense of freedom and validation that had once seemed impossible. He had come so far from the back of the classroom to the very top of his grade. He had wrestled with doubt and hurt, relying on the unbreakable spirit of the black community, past heroes and present supporters alike, to guide him. And in doing so, he had opened minds, changed perceptions, and reminded everyone that when you're given a seat in the back, you can still stand up tall in front of the world.